Well, here we are again, public interest before corporate interests. Today, well, it's morning here, you may hear the birds, but I want to look at the concept of the universal struggle between fact and fiction. Because what social media has done, it has magnified that struggle. It's not a new struggle. Fact and fiction have always been part and parcel of the human condition. And when you look at fact and fiction, you have to look at who benefits. And normally, who benefits from the struggle between fact and fiction are those who exercise power. If fact does not coincide with their fictional accounts, well, you ignore the fact, and that's the history of the human race. I mean, the Aztecs used to strongly believe, that the sun could only stay in the sky, it wouldn't fall out of the sky, unless they did human sacrifices. The Druids believed that unless you did human sacrifices when you built a major building, well, that building wouldn't stand. And the list goes on and on. Historically, human beings have been able to subvert fact to suit their particular position in the landscape. And the age of rationality in the 17th and 18th century was an age when fact began to overtake fiction, and we had a large degree of scientific analysis occurring, the scientific method being established. Now, it doesn't mean that science can't be used in order to reinforce the power of those who exercise power, but what it meant was there was a mechanism by which you could separate fact and fiction. Now, fiction is a fundamental part of human existence, and if you look at the Australian colonisation process, it was based on the fiction which was incorporated in law of terra nullius, that this continent and the islands around this continent were inhabited by no one, although people had been living here, had been coexisting in the physical environment for over 60,000 years, and some people say up to 70,000 years. You know, a continuous living culture. Now, when you look at the rise of National Socialism and the Nazis, I mean, their fiction was based on the fact that the Jews had total control over the financial sector, and they were able to put in place a train of events which led to the Holocaust, at the same time as Jews would be exterminated because of their supposedly control of the financial sector. The Nazi hierarchy was enriching themselves, and at the same time, people who had been ostracised and marginalised in German society, gypsies, communists, anarchists, homosexuals, the disabled, were all being removed, were all being killed in order to purify the race. So it's not a matter of just looking in the past and saying that fact and fiction was a fundamental part of maintaining the power of those who exercised power in the past. It's something that we see today, and it's something which is being magnified by social media, where fictional accounts can grow exponentially within a few hours and take a hold on thinking around the globe, as over half the world's population is somehow involved with privately owned platforms whose major role is to gather their information and sell that information to advertisers to augment profits. So it's no accident that some of the biggest corporations on the planet today are those that gather individual information. So why has fiction become such an important role in 21st century society, where we are supposed to be rational, where we no longer think that we need to make human sacrifices in order for the sun to stay in the, not fall down onto the planet Earth and destroy everyone? So why is it? Well, it's for one very important reason. And as I said before, fact and fiction have been part and parcel of the Australian landscape. We like to think of ourselves, we think of ourselves in an egalitarian community. Whenever over 700,000 children live in poverty, and over 1/3 of the population relies on a social security system which barely covers the basic necessities of everyday existence. We like to think of ourselves as a society where education is the great leveller, and everybody can access education because we have a public education sector. And the reality is that we have private charities now raising money in order to ensure that Australian children are properly educated in the public education sector, which is supposed to provide universal free secular education. Then we have the ridiculous notion of us being some type of caring community, when we see our interaction with the rest of the world is based on maintaining our alliances, especially with the United States of America. And the list goes on and on. So fact and fiction have always been fundamental parts of Australian society. But we now have a different fiction, a fiction which is based on creating confusion within Australian society. A fiction which has distracted people from the fundamental struggle to create a more egalitarian community, to introduce democratic values in society, and to ensure that the Commonwealth is used for the common good. And we see this in many ways. We see fictional accounts which are laughable, fictional accounts which are really not destructive in any way, like people still continue to believe that the Earth is flat, people believe that the moon landing was a hoax, and the list goes on and on. These are things which people believe which really have no impact on the way we live. Then comes the more destructive elements, where fact and fiction are melded into a new narrative. And we've seen that with the explosion of COVID-19 around the planet, where we've now reached the ridiculous situation where we can get out of this situation, but a significant proportion of the population, especially in the Western world, which has forgotten the history of the pandemics and the history of disease and the history of mass deaths because of vaccination, who now think that somehow COVID-19 vaccination is some type of evil plot. So you get this blurring between fact and fiction, and we have a situation where the country lurches from lockdown to lockdown, although we are seeing more and more vaccines becoming available to deal with COVID-19. So you've got this melding, the border between fact and fiction has disappeared. We even got people talking about alternative facts. There's no such thing as an alternative fact. A fact is a fact is a fact is a fact. Terra nullius was fiction. It was historical fiction. It was legal fiction. It was fiction. Didn't matter how many wise narratives we put down on paper continue to be fiction. And we see this same problem between fact and fiction occur in the community as far as race relations are concerned, as far as people making judgments about sections of the population because of the way they dress or their religious beliefs or the language they speak or their cultural practices. There's this fact and fiction, as I said, is fundamental. It's a fundamental narrative in the human story. But today, what would have taken decades to occur now happens almost instantaneously through social media. So we are seeing supposedly intelligent people who have access to information, to facts, dismiss these facts because they have seen an article or a comment or a site on social media which picks the facts they want to pick without putting them into a wider context to reinforce opinions which are fictional. And this is having a profound effect on society. And the more democratic a society, the greater the possibility that disinformation and fiction have a profound impact on that society, and more authoritarian societies and communities around the world have realised that this is the Achilles heel of so-called representative democracies, where if you sow confusion amongst a population, you can help to destroy that society. At the same time, we are seeing those who exercise power revelling in the artificial divisions which are appearing in society. We are seeing artificial schisms and divisions appearing in society which have nothing to do with the struggle to devolve power and share wealth, and everything to do with dividing and conquering the population, turning people on each other. Using these divisions, they are able to sabotage any attempts to create a viable opposition to their narrative, a narrative based on the concept of private investment for private profit, a narrative on ensuring that those who exercise power continue to exercise power, a narrative which is based on corporatisation, globalisation, privatisation and deregulation, a narrative which makes parliamentary representatives little more than puppets of that small section of society that owns the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. A narrative which splits, divides opposition to the current situation, an opposition which has historically been based on that struggle to devolve power and share wealth. But now we see the community turn on itself. We saw over the last few decades the community turn on differences, in cultural differences, language differences, the way people dressed, gender differences, sexual orientation. But now we're moving into a new phase of creating division, because as more and more attention is based to racism and sexism, and more and more state attention is based to acknowledge and hopefully to try to resolve these issues, we now see a new phase of disinformation which is based on people refusing to accept fact. We now see people termed to be influencers who have monetarised this struggle, who are making money out of disinformation, who through social media are able to draw people to their sites and be paid for the privilege of drawing people to their sites, irrespective of the content of that material, because ultimately these new platforms, Google, Facebook, and the list goes on, TikTok, and the list goes on and on, these new platforms are based on the concept of gathering information, using that information to sell to advertisers. So the more eyes that you can bring to your site through peddling misinformation, through peddling fictional accounts or fictional analysis or analysis which have no relation to reality, the more eyes focus on your site, the more money you make from these platforms. So we are now seeing the concept of private investment for private profit destroying any reliance on fact. There's interpretation, there's fact, and there's fiction. Obviously you can have different interpretation of facts. And let's not forget that to a significant degree science is not independent of the drive to create profits. But the new technology has created a platform where disinformation creates profits not only for the major influencers in this new technology who draw eyes to their platforms through sensational accounts of reality, but also the shareholders who continue to support these platforms. So if you are a shareholder, if you have superannuation, which you don't take much interest in, and that money is used to support the Amazons of the world, the Googles of the world, the Facebooks of the world, the TikToks of the world, and the list goes on and on, then you are as much a part of the problem. You are part of the problem, not part of the solution to the problem. And the solution to the problem is to dry the money, to stop paying influencers, to ensure that your interaction on social media is one based on you using those platforms to search for facts, not so-called alternative facts, and not be drawn into the whirlpools that have been created, which basically put people through the same processes over and over again in order to maximise profits from influencers and these platforms. This is a major issue because when, as I said before, when you have a vaccination with minimal side effects, which many people are refusing to have in the Western world because of the propaganda, and that's all it is, the propaganda which has appeared on social media, which is there basically to fill the pockets of those people who are termed to be influencers, who draw eyes to their media, to their sites, because of the sensational elements on that site. I think it's time that we reassessed social media, we reassessed the whole situation, and we put exceptional pressure to ensure that fact always triumphs over fiction. Because if fact doesn't triumph over fiction, we will find ourselves in the same situation people who are trying to understand the world without any scientific knowledge, the myths they created in order to understand that world, and in many regards the damage they caused because they felt they needed to cause that damage in order for the society to exist. So think about it. You do have options. We always have options. We can change. And as the human race, we have changed consistently. But to allow these new platforms to dominate political discussion and turn us away from the major issues which face us, which is the growing inequality in power and wealth on this planet, is a mistake.